Timor-Leste is a wonderful place if you love speaking languages, and a bit of a nightmare if you hate learning them. For a country of just over 1 million people, we have plenty of languages to choose from. Firstly, each ethnic group has its own language. There are perhaps 27 of these, although it depends on what you call a language. Then we have 2 official languages, Tetun Dili and Portuguese. And on top of that, we have 2 so-called working languages, Indonesian and English. With so much choice, which one do we use when we meet people we don't know? This morning when I went to the market and I went to look at the show over the road, I spoke Tetun Dili with the local ladies. I can hear those of you who are Timorese saying, of course, that's what we do when we meet people we don't know. But why would it be, of course? I grew up speaking Dutch at home and English at school. The ladies I was speaking with grew up speaking their own language, Suai, at home and Indonesian at school. And anyway, it's not just Timorese who speak Tetun in Timor. The other day I was in the shop speaking Tetun Dili with a young man from Korea, to the great interest of the shop assistants listening in. So the question I want to ask today is, why in Timor-Leste do we speak Tetun Dili with people from other language groups? Of course, it's an official language, but it's only been that since 2002 when Timor-Leste became independent. And it was a language of intercultural communication long before that. So my question goes back further in time. Why is Tetun Dili a lingua franca? Why Tetun, when we have so many languages to choose from? Some with much larger populations than Tetun Dili, and some much closer to the capital Dili. For an answer to this, we need to look into Timor's past, trying to connect the dots of evidence. For it's in the past that we find explanations of the present. It's an amazing story, really, with Timorese rulers, Portuguese rulers, priests and traders, Makassarese traders, and lots of ordinary people like ourselves whose names have never been recorded. Of course, you can never be sure you've connected the dots of evidence correctly, but we'll give it a go. See what you think. But first, some background on Tetun. Those of you who live in Timor are no doubt aware that there are 2 languages called Tetun. The first, often called Tetun Terik, is spoken along the border between East and West Timor and further east along the south coast. It's the original. In the view of many of my Tetun Terik friends, it's the best. There are various dialects, but if we speak one dialect, then we can understand people from the other dialects fairly well. The second Tetun is called Tetun Dili, after the capital. These days, it's spoken all over the country, in schools, in churches, the media, parliament. In the last referendum in 2015, there were even 31% of the population who said they spoke it as their main language at home. But historically, it wasn't like that. Even just over a generation ago in 1990, only 7% of the population spoke Tetun Dili at home, and almost all of them were in the capital Dili. The only official use of Tetun Dili was in church, and for people outside of Dili, if they spoke Tetun at all, it was probably as an informal language of intercultural communication, what we call a lingua franca. So let's go back to the question. Why, when there are so many languages, do we speak Tetun Dili? The answer, as is so often the case, comes back to who ruled whom. When we as a community speak the language of another group, it's usually because we've been ruled by them. Just take the example of English in India and the Philippines, Spanish in much of South America, and here in Timor-Leste, Portuguese and Indonesian. Each of these languages is the language of a former ruler. Tetun, as it turns out, is no exception. To understand Tetun, we need to understand Tetun kingdoms. The island of Timor has always had a system of kingship, with lots of hereditary rulers ruling over small fiefdoms. Amongst these kingdoms, there was a hierarchy. with lesser kingdoms paying tribute to greater ones. 500 years ago, which is as far back as we have records, there were three major kingdoms which ruled almost the whole of Timor-Leste, of the island of Timor. In the west, there was a kingdom of Sombai. They spoke a language called betelnut, and it covered most of the western half of the island. In the east, there was the kingdom of Luka, and in the center, there was the kingdom of Wehali. These two kingdoms of Luka and Wehali were Tetun Terik speaking. What sort of kingdoms were they? It seems they were quite large. According to one document, 500 years ago, the king of Wehali had 46 other kingdoms under him. They were reported to be all free and independent of one another. Other documents suggest it wasn't quite that idyllic. There were frequent rebellions and wars, so that the number of subject kingdoms varied. What sort of power did they have? We really don't know. But they were involved in the sandalwood trade. They had quite large armies. And other than that, perhaps their rule was more ritual and symbolic rather than executive. Whatever the case, these three kingdoms between them covered most of the island of Timor. How far did the languages of these kingdoms spread? Well, according to one document, before the arrival of Europeans, the island of Timor was inhabited by the Belus and the Vaikenus. The Vaikenus clearly are the Baikenu-speaking people of the western part of the island, the ones governed by Sombai. The Belus, who dominated the east, are almost certainly Tetun-speaking people. After all, the kingdom of Wehali is in a district which even today is called Belu. These two, the Belus and the Vaikenus, were described as two provinces and two peoples. Is it possible that the entire island of Timor, just 500 years ago, had only two peoples and two languages? Of course it isn't. But there's surely truth in it. 15 years ago, when Rob, my husband, and I used to visit a village in the far east of East Timor, where very few people spoke Tetun at the time, sometimes we'd get to a house and we'd see children scurrying out the back door, looking for the nearest Tetun speaker. Only once the Tetun speakers arrived would they open the door to us, and only the Tetun speakers would converse with us. Surely, when Portuguese traders and missionaries arrived, people would greet them in the language that they normally used for greeting foreigners or any outsiders. That was Baikenu in the west and Tetun in the east. So we see that 500 years ago, Tetun was already a lingua franca in Timor. What happened when the Portuguese came? The Portuguese were attracted primarily by sandalwood, and their first shipment of sandalwood out of Timor was in 1515. But it wasn't until well over 100 years later, in 1641, that they set up their first permanent base. This was in Lefau, in the west, in the Baikenu-speaking territory. They set it up mainly to protect their access to sandalwood against Makassarese traders. The settlers were so-called Topasses, or Black Portuguese, mixed-race people of Portuguese and islander descent. They spoke Portuguese, Malay, and a language very similar to Baikenu. Even after many years in Lefau, they didn't speak Tetun. Of course not. It was outside the reach of the Tetun-speaking kingdoms. If the capital had stayed in Lefau, I rather doubt that Tetun would ever have become an official language of Timor-Leste. Anyway, back to the Topasses. They settled in Lefau and they conquered Sombai, the supreme ruler of the West. And Sombai was baptized as a Catholic. The king of Wehali, the one in the center, heard about this and he promptly decided to convert to Islam. After all, you had to decide who to trade with. The mainly Protestant Dutch, the Catholic Portuguese, or the Muslim Makassarese. The Topasses were very upset at this new alliance with the Makassarese, and they headed down to Wehali with 90 musketeers, and they burnt the place down. And that was the end of Wehali. Or was it? Timorese aren't that easily defeated now, and surely weren't then either. The power of Wehali was reduced for a long time, but eventually they rose from the ashes. There's a story from about 70 years later, in 1712, that the king of Lucca and the king of Wehali met at the river Babulu, on the border of what's now East and West Timor, and they made a sacred pact. The king of Lucca would govern the eastern side, and the king of Wehali would govern the western side. If serious strife should arise, what they called karau nakfera, or buffaloes exploding, then these two kings would broker peace. For the first few hundred years of Portuguese presence in Timor, they mainly dealt directly with rulers like these two. It was only once they started to rule more directly that the king of Lucca lost his power. At about the same time, the king of Wehali lost his power to the Dutch. This was not that much more than 100 years ago. But by then, Tetun had become enough of a lingua franca. It was firmly established, and it no longer needed the support of these two kingdoms. In 1769, Portugal moved its capital from Lifau to Dili, its present location. It's a funny story, really. The Topasses might have been called Black Portuguese and spoken Portuguese, but they didn't accept any of the officials that Portugal sent to rule them. Eventually, a new governor came and he managed to take control of Lifau, but it didn't last long. He soon found himself under siege from the Topasses, and when he'd run out of food, he fled in the night and sailed eastward and set up his new base in Dili, which is why Dili is now the capital. Dili was in Mumbai-speaking territory. Even today, Mumbai is spoken around the outskirts of the city. But it wasn't long before Dili was bilingual, not in Mumbai, but in Portuguese and Tetun. Why Tetun? It wasn't the language of the former capital Lifau. It wasn't the language of the land on which Dili was established, and it wasn't the language of the colonizers. Clearly, it had become enough of a lingua franca that it became the language of this new multi-ethnic township. So this brings us to a new phase of the development of Tetun. In the mid-1800s, about 150 years ago, Tetun was spoken alongside Portuguese in the capital, and it started to develop into what is now recognized as Tetun Dili, a Tetun Terik base with simplified grammar and a lot of Portuguese loans. It was about this time, too, that Portugal started to rule more intensively throughout Timor-Leste. One of the surprising side effects of this rule is that Tetun spread further. One way it spread was through the church. The church was using Tetun as one of its languages of prayers and of the catechism. On this slide, you can see a photo of the first Tetun book that we know of, which is a catechism from 1885. The Jesuits also set up a college in Suai in the east, close to the old kingdom of Suai. And graduates from this school became school teachers all over the colony, as well as serving in public service. And this too helped to spread the influence of Tetun. As one who learned Tetun in Wehali, in the centre, it's often struck me that the Tetun we speak in Dili is closer to that of Lucca and Soibada than it is to the Tetun of Wehali. And I wonder whether that's the influence of the college or whether it's the influence of the earlier kingdom of Lucca. I don't know. But it wasn't just the church that spread Tetun. Ironically, it was also the colonial government. I say ironically because the language of government was clearly Portuguese. Nevertheless, old people have told me that they learned Tetun through attending meetings with colonial officials. I also wonder how much the coffee industry contributed to the spread of Tetun, with its planters and its traders. Because when Portuguese rule finished in 1975, there were more Tetun speakers in the coffee growing west of the colony than there were further east. So far, we've been looking at the evidence of history, but there are other dots of evidence which point to Tetun having been influential far beyond its borders. These dots come in the form of place names. You would think that each ethnic group would name places using its own language, and to a large extent this is true. But there are also numerous places in Timor, especially the eastern part, which have Tetun place names, even though the people of that place are from another language group. The most famous of these is Pohomatabian, the mountain of the spirits of the dead, which is surrounded by people from various language groups, but not Tetun. This map shows those sukus, local government areas, for which I have located at least one Tetun place name. The darker colours indicates at least 3. Some of these place names might be fairly new, but some have been recorded in documents at least 200 years ago. So, as you can see, Tetun place names are scattered throughout much of Timor-Leste, albeit very unevenly, with 2 exceptions. There are none in Okusi, in the far west, around Lifau, and there are none in the far east. It's not surprising, because the influence of the 2 Tetun Terik speaking kingdoms didn't reach to those parts. This is also why when Timor-Leste became independent in 2002, these 2 districts were renowned as having very few people who could speak Tetun. The story of Tetun Dili is a reminder that we live in a world shaped by stories from the past, with players who never dreamt that their actions then would influence our choice of language so many hundreds of years later. It's a reminder that we too are playing out stories that will impact the generations to come.